It is a great pleasure to be back in Japan for this G7 summit. My message to G7 leaders is clear. While the economic picture is uncertain everywhere, rich countries cannot ignore the fact that more than half the world, the vast majority of countries, are suffering through a deep financial crisis. The crushing economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, unsustainable levels of debt, rising interest rates, and inflation are devastating developing and emerging economies. Poverty and hunger are rising, and development is sinking. As I see it, the problems facing developing countries have three dimensions: moral, power-related, and practical. First, moral. There is a systemic and unjust bias in global economic and financial frameworks in favor of rich countries, which is naturally generating great frustration in the developing world. Access to COVID-19 vaccines was deeply unfair. The recovery has been extremely unbalanced. Rich countries recovered from the economic impact of the pandemic with expansionary monetary and fiscal policies. Basically, they printed money and spent their way out of trouble. Developing countries, many with substantial debts, were unable to do so. The IMF allocated $650 billion in special drawing rights, or SDRs, during the pandemic, essentially creating money from nothing. The G7 countries, with a population of 772 million people, received $280 billion. The African continent, with a population of 1.3 billion people, received only $34 billion. And this was done according to the rules. But from a moral point of view, there is something fundamentally wrong with the rules themselves. Around the world, 52 countries are in debt distress, near debt distress, or face extremely expensive market financing. Middle-income countries, including many small island developing states, with few exceptions, do not qualify for concessional funding and have no access to debt relief. Second, the power dimension. The Bretton Woods system and the Security Council reflect the power relations of 1945. The global financial architecture is outdated, dysfunctional, and unfair. In the face of the economic shocks from the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it has failed to fulfill its core function as a global safety net. It's time to reform both the Security Council and the Bretton Woods institutions. And this is essentially a question of redistributing power in line with the realities of today's world. Third, the practical problem. Even with the present unfair global rules, more can and must be done to support developing countries. We have proposed an SDG stimulus that would provide an effective mechanism for debt relief and scale up long-term and contingency financing. If multilateral development banks work together and change their business models and approach to risk, they could massively leverage private finance for developing countries at reasonable cost. Reallocating SDRs, as Japan has done, and channeling them through multilateral development banks would have a multiplying effect on finance for sustainable development. Innovative financial tools could enable swaps that convert debt into investment in climate adaptation, and the list goes on. At the same time, G7 countries are central to climate action. We are heading for a temperature rise of 2.8 degrees by the end of this century with the present policies. The next 5 years are likely to be the hottest on record. Climate action is working, but we are clearly off track. The acceleration agenda I proposed aims to make up for lost time. It calls for all G7 countries to reach net zero as close as possible to 2040 and for emerging economies to do so as close as possible to 2050. Our Climate Solidarity Pact calls on all G7 countries to mobilize financial and technical resources to support emerging economies in accelerating decarbonization so that we stay within the 1.5 degree limit of global heating. And this requires faster timelines to phase out fossil fuels and ramp up new renewables. It means putting a price on carbon and ending fossil fuel subsidies. I call on the G7 to phase out coal completely by 2030. At the same time, we need climate justice. Countries that did the least to cause the climate crisis are suffering most. We must ramp up adaptation and early warning systems to help communities on the front lines. 50% of climate finance for developing countries must go to adaptation. It's high time for developed countries to provide the promised $100 billion per year. And the Loss and Damage Fund agreed in Sharm el-Sheikh must be operationalized. The city of Hiroshima is a testament to the human spirit. Whenever I visit, I'm inspired by the courage and resilience of the Hibakusha. The United Nations stands with them. We will never stop pushing for a world free of nuclear weapons. I thank Japan for its generous support to the Youth Leader Fund for a world without nuclear weapons. We must invest in and empower today's young people to be change makers for a safer and more secure world. At the same time, Hiroshima is a global symbol of the tragic consequences when nations fail to work together and settle their differences peacefully. In our multipolar world, as geopolitical division grows, no country or group of countries can stand by as billions of people struggle with the basics of food, water, education, healthcare and jobs. Here in Hiroshima, it's time to demonstrate global leadership and global solidarity. Thank you.